Hey there, Chandler here, and I had a really good question come up today at the coffee shop this morning, and I'm glad it came up because it's one that we could all benefit from understanding in a little more nuanced fashion. The question was, look, I'm strapped for time, how do I quickly build flexibility? And I think this is a fantastic question because people have sort of a mixed understanding of what flexibility really is. You know, we think of being able to touch your toes or doing the splits, whatever. But I have Phileas here to help demonstrate what flexibility really is. So flexibility, we gotta find a term for, because again, terminology kind of determines what we're working with. Our words have meanings. We need to make that clear. So flexibility is just the range of motion of a joint. And Phileas here, despite being sort of a plastic model with metal facets, has pretty good flexibility, right? He has this range of motion throughout the joint. So he has fantastic flexibility. He could do the splits no problem. Very flexible guy. The thing is, he's not mobile at all. He has no control over that range of motion. If I weren't here to help him get his arm overhead, his arm's not going overhead, right? And that's the key difference between flexibility and mobility. A lot of people say they want more flexibility. They don't necessarily need that. They don't need more range of motion in the joint. What they need is more control over that range of motion. And you might try this little test out for yourself with a partner. What you could do is lie on your back and try and lift your leg just as high as it can go, keeping the leg straight. So you're on your back and you're lifting your leg up. And you'll get a sense of your mobility in the hip joint. Now, what you need to do is let yourself be a wet noodle here, let yourself be heavy, let your partner lift your leg in that same pattern, and odds are good it'll go a little bit further, right? You have more flexibility than you have mobility. You have a lot more range of motion than you can actually control. And so when people say, how do I build flexibility quickly? I think what we actually need is, how do we build mobility? And that's a whole other story. So basically, the reason why our flexibility might outrange our mobility is, again, we don't have control over that range of motion. If we can control that, we demonstrate to the nervous system that that is a safe range of motion, that it's one that, again, we can be strong throughout. And so oftentimes when we want to build mobility, we just need to take the brakes off. See, here's the thing. You might have heard me say this before. Your nervous system is hardwired for survival. Again, it doesn't care how many Instagram likes you have, whether you can touch your toes or not. It wants to keep you alive and keep you functioning. And so if it senses that reaching into this overhead position might cause danger to the joint itself, that you might cause physical harm, you might threaten your system's integrity, it will put the brakes on your range of motion, and it'll feel like tension. Because the nervous system regulates all of our muscular activity. All of those signals, whether it's a bicep curl, a squat, a jump, whatever, they start in the nervous system. They start with an intention. And so if the nervous system thinks, again, that range of motion, that flexibility is dangerous, it's going to put the brakes on. It's going to tighten up here, or if we're touching our toes, it'll tighten up in the low back, the glutes, the hamstrings, all the way down the chain. It stems from this desperate desire to keep your living system safe, to maintain the integrity there. So if we want to build this mobility quickly, if we want to take the brakes off quickly, how do we do it? Here's one of my simple kind of formulas that I use to develop strength and really tell the nervous system it's safe within that range of motion. So what I'll do is, throughout the day, I'll take note of any positions of restriction. You know, if I'm going through my sort of morning joint rotations, I'll feel, okay, my shoulder might be a little tight here, or I can't reach as far down as I would like to. I just want to be aware of those positions of restriction. What you can do next is find yourself in a position of tension. Say you can't touch your toes, for example. That's a biggie for a lot of people. But if you're watching this, maybe that's easy for you. Say you can't do a gymnastics straddle, whatever. Find a position of tension, and you're going to hang out there for a little bit. And what I want you to do first is focus on your breath. Make sure that you don't have this kind of reaction coming on. Again, that's sort of that red flag system in the nervous system. But the breath is cool because we can bring conscious control to it and sort of reverse engineer our stress response to that unfamiliar, possibly dangerous position. So focus on the breath. And if there's a particular part of the breath to focus on, It is your exhalation. Make sure in that position of tension, you can breathe out fully. That will help down-regulate this very high neural tone. So breathe, first and foremost. That's a fundamental way to establish safety and establish function within this position. Next step, simply orient in space. Again, this is a very primal mechanism, goes deep, deep, deep into our neuromuscular hardwiring. So in this position of tension, breathe and simply look around. See how far you can look up, down, around, look all over the place. Orienting, again, goes pretty deep in our developmental roots here. That's step 2. Step 3, I just want you to reach through space. See where you can reach, what you can reach up to. And again, this is a very primitive, very primal functional response. It's one that can generate a huge amount of ease in our neuromuscular system. When we demonstrate, hey, nervous system, not only is this position safe, it's functional. I can move with integrity and with control in this restricted position. So if you can breathe, if you can orient, and you can reach, I guarantee you'll free up space in that position of restriction. Again, whether it's touching your toes, in a gymnastic straddle, in this overhead position, whatever it is, those 3 mechanisms are a fantastic way to open up space in the body, to demonstrate safety and control within that tense range of motion. Okay, so we've talked now about how we open up space in a neurological sense. We're playing a little brain trickery with our bodies here, which of course more or less leads to a short-term benefit. The question then is, how do we turn this into long-term benefit? How do we retain and maintain this increased range of motion? And here's what we need to do. In addition to opening up space, we need to start training within that new range of motion. So say you have difficulty touching your toes, for example. If you go through this breathe, orient, and reach process, odds are good you can reach quite a bit further. Again, short-term neuroplastic change here. We've shifted how our brain views our body. To maintain this in the long term and really build control, we want to generate lasting physiological changes, actual structural changes in our muscular and our skeletal systems. How do we do that? We load that range of motion. We generate force through that full range. Force, to quote really smart guy, Dr. Andrea Ospina, force is the language of cells. Movement is how we speak that language. Our conscious movement is how we start talking to our cells and how we generate these lasting physiological changes. So again, we've done a little bit of neural trickery. Let's say we can touch our toes at this point, whereas before we could only touch our knees. What comes next? We start to load that range of motion. If you have tight hamstrings, open up space in the hamstrings and then look at your hinge pattern. Look at your deadlift. See if you can go from a traditional hinge, standard deadlift, to a Romanian deadlift with straight legs. Gradually work to increase the amount of force you can generate here. There are a few ways you could do that. You could load through increased volume, doing more sets, more repetitions at the same weight. Really start to acclimate your body and say, this is safe for, again, a prolonged period of time. Volume is a great way to go about building those physiological changes. Second way we can do it is through intensity. Say you've opened up that range of motion, now hit some heavier deadlifts in that position. Again, just a for instance. You could do this with an overhead press, a row, a pull. I think you get the idea. Now, intensity, again, is that second way to do it. We can look at volume, doing more sets, more reps. We can look at intensity, doing heavier sets, heavier reps. Or we can look at complexity, at variation. It's a third way we can start to generate those neuroplastic changes. Maybe looking at widening our deadlift stance, widening our grip, narrowing our grip. Those variations, if we train them in a consistent manner, will lead to those sort of necessary physiological changes. Again, you've imposed a demand on your body, and your body wants to make specific adaptations. So let's put this all in perspective. Let's come up with a tidy package here. Let's say we've gone through our neurological process of breathing, orienting, and reaching. We've now opened up space. In order to maintain that space for the long term, we need to load that range of motion in a pretty controlled manner, right? We don't want to be flopping our way through it. Move slowly, move with control. And if you can start to impose those demands of more strength, more endurance, more power endurance, etc., if you can impose those demands, your body will necessarily make tissue changes to adapt to that stress, as long as it's a manageable stress. So after you've gone through your neurological trickery, we'll call it, in step one, this next part, loading, make sure you don't overdo it right away. If you've opened up new space, you're probably actually going to have less strength than you would imagine. So your deadlift might go down 100 pounds to start, but very quickly you will build that back up. As you start to generate more and more force over more range of motion, your body will necessarily adapt, and that is a really cool thing. So that's how we end up making lasting changes, building off of our short-term question, how do I get more flexible more quickly? Because again, flexibility is cool, but if you can only reach your arm overhead after a lengthy warm-up, if you can only do the splits at the very end of yoga class, for example, you don't own that range of motion. The splits is definitely a range of motion I don't own yet, but working on it, slowly but surely. But the thing is, those short-term changes, what we associate with stretching, it's a neural effect only. To make lasting progress, we need to make those physiological changes to our musculoskeletal systems. That's where the magic happens. And that takes consistent loading over the long term. It's not an overnight process. It can't be. You can open up space, but to really own it, it's going to take consistent training and progressive overload of those tissues. Not beating the shit out of yourself right off the bat, making slow, steady gains in strength, in volume, again, for the long term. And that is how we really start to own our mobility and own these ranges of motion. So, try that out. Start with your neural trickery and get a plan in place to progressively overload those tissues. That's how you're going to find true control over your body.